Hi everyone, I want to start off by saying that I miss y'all so much. I know this is probably the 30th or 100th time that you've heard this saying, but I truly do miss all of you, and I cannot wait until we're reunited in our youth room. But until then, I'm going to go ahead and teach this Bible study. So first, I want to start off by thanking Brother and Sister Henny for this opportunity to go ahead and speak to y'all today. So I'll go ahead and get started. I'll be reading from the book of Psalms, chapter 32, verses 8 and 9. Here, David writes, I will instruct thee and teach thee in the way which thou shalt go. I will guide thee with mine eye. Be ye not as the horse or as the mule, which have no understanding, whose mouth must be held in with bit and bridle, lest they come near unto thee. From this text, I want to go ahead and highlight the words bit and bridle. So I went ahead and looked them up. And bit is an assembly that defines contacts and controls the horse's mouth. And bridle is an attachment to the bit, which is placed on the horse's head. A rider will use these two tools on a horse and mule due to their oversensitivity in the mouth. With these tools, they'll apply a pressure that will give the rider full autonomy and direction. So then the question is, why use these tools? Why not just use some type of voice command? Why not use just a love tap? Well, in the instance of a mule, I'm sure we've heard the term as stubborn as a mule. Mules are a mix between a horse and a donkey that generally weigh between 800 and 1,000 pounds. Pretty heavy. So if a mule doesn't want to move, he's not going to unless you make him, which is where the bit and bridle come in. In the instance of a horse, horses are very strong animals that can travel as fast as 55 miles is what I've read. If they are moving in a direction the rider doesn't like, they're not going to just change directions from that voice command or that love tap. Some type of force is going to need to be applied just to stop or change directions. So without that bit and bridle, horses and mules become less useful to the rider. If a mule is destined or is required to go ahead and send out some type of cargo, and they choose not to move just because of their stubbornness, that rider is going to have to either carry on some of that load or use another resource. So it becomes to a point where the rider has to carry more of a burden rather than use the mule as an asset. And so we never want to get to a point with God where we're more of a burden than an asset. Don't create more problems where you can find more solutions. So earlier I mentioned the fact that they're using pressure with the bit and bridle. So due to that pressure and the oversensitive mouths, horses and mules are going to feel some pain, especially when they're first introduced. So unfortunately, the less trained the rider is, the worse that pain is for the horse or mule. And over time, you end up with a broken horse or mule, or as it's defined, an animal trained to ride. After feeling that pressure from the bit and bridle over and over again, eventually horses and mules have adapted to that pain and pressure, and the feeling transitions from severe to mild. So it gets to a point where they've just tolerated the pain. It's just become a part of their life. So then the question is, how does this apply to us? Why does this matter for us? So something I think we generally pray for, or that we're seeking, especially during times like this, is that, we need direction. God, where are you trying to lead us? Where are you taking our church? And so personally for me, I am a very indecisive person. For me, I struggle with just what to eat. That's just not something that comes naturally to me. I have a lot of preferences. And so when you have a lot of options presented towards me, I don't know which one to choose. Even though there's no severe consequences from it, it's that life or death for me. And even what to teach for this Bible study, I probably went through several different topics before arriving at this one. And it just gets to a point where I have too many options again. But that might not be the case for all of you. You might not be as indecisive about your food options, but maybe some of you are graduating soon and you're indecisive about what's next. You might be questioning, God, what school should I go to? Or where should I go to work? What's my career going to be? Should I stay in Gainesville? Should I stay where I've known all my life? Or should I move on, go somewhere else, take my talent somewhere else? Or you might not be in that situation. Maybe you're comfortable where you are professionally, but you don't know where you're going spiritually. Maybe you're trying to figure out what ministry to get involved in or where you fit in. When we ask these questions, it's easy to ask God to just drag us to where he wants us to go. It gets to a point where we start establishing a horse mentality and we just say, God, push me through the door that's best. I'm just going to trust. Or God, just drag me along. I'm here for the ride. I'll just go wherever you want me. Yet David tells us God doesn't want our lives to be like a horse or mule. I mean, we just read it. God doesn't want us to be under physical control or pain to choose between the options in front of us. In Psalms 32:8, we are told that God will instruct us and teach us in the way which we should go. So I'm going to walk you through a scenario. So imagine you're blindfolded in a maze. Okay. And you have to find your way out. In scenario 1, you have a shock collar. Every time you start walking in the wrong direction, you get shocked. So just say you're walking through the maze, all of a sudden you take a right when you're supposed to take a left, and you get shocked. And in order to keep finding your way out, you learn that you have to turn around every time you get shocked. And then once you start walking in that right direction, you don't feel anything. And you keep going back and forth between getting shocked and finding your way to the right direction so you can finally exit that maze. Or let's go through scenario 2. So let's say you're still blindfolded, but we remove the shock collar. And this time, someone's just telling you the directions. And if you're listening closely, then you will go ahead and eventually find your way out. It's safe to assume we would prefer the second scenario, right? I'd prefer not to get shocked. That way we just listen and escape the maze. Yet sometimes we choose to live a life with scenario 1 where we constantly get shocked and go through pain just to learn a lesson. Rather than reading God's word or taking the time to listen, we choose to sin and experience the pain that comes with it. Sometimes we do it over and over again until we eventually find our way out. But sadly, in some cases, we know that people never find their way out. They just learn to tolerate the pain. We should never get to a point where we normalize the pain. Like the horse and mule, you may adapt to the pain and allow it to become a part of your life. Yet God did not intend for us to live our lives with a bit and brittle, to suffer unnecessary pain for his control and direction. We're not just here for a ride from destination to destination. So then I say all this and you may ask, okay, so how are we supposed to live our lives? And God compares our lives to a sheep. So if you read further in text, David writes in Psalms 103, chapter 100, verse 3. Know ye that the Lord, he is God. It is he that hath made us, and not we ourselves. We are his people, and the sheep of his pasture. A pasture is a grassland with low vegetation used for grazing and for sheep to roam freely. So we're supposed to live our lives as sheep in a pasture. I don't know much about sheep, but the much I've learned is, according to Sheep 201, a beginner's guide to raising sheep, sheep are moved very often from pasture to pasture. Therefore, shepherds must train sheep with a vocal command or rattle of the feed bucket. So we learn horses and mules use a bit and bridle, dogs use a leash, but sheep roam free under a vocal command or the rattle of a feed bucket. Our rattle of the feed bucket could easily be the sound of the great trumpet. Yet while we await that sound, we must listen for our shepherd's voice. So we all know you learn his voice through his word, prayer, fasting, meditation, whatever it may be. Then with time, we will recognize the shepherd's voice well enough that we can make decisions knowing he guided us there rather than dragged us. Yet, if you're struggling to hear his voice, know these 2 points. Point number 1, it might just be an opportunity where you need to draw closer. Sometimes we find ourselves in front of several options and we feel like we're not hearing God, and so we assume he's just not speaking, and it's up to us to decide. But it just mean that we're too far to go ahead and hear him. So take that opportunity to spend more time in meditation and prayer so that you can hear that voice. And the second point may be the fact that maybe you just don't know enough to find his voice on your own. And that's totally okay. Maybe you're still learning. Maybe you don't know how to build that relationship with God. And hopefully, it gets to a point that you are able to find it. But in the meantime, hopefully this example helps. So for young sheep, they don't have as much experience with the shepherd. They haven't experienced the protection from the shepherd. They haven't received the nurturing, or at least created the connotation between the shepherd and the food that they're receiving. So they have a harder time listening at first when there's instructions. Yet by instinct, they know to follow the flock. So it is important that there are good examples in the flock for the survival of the young sheep. So when our youth group has good examples to follow, especially for our 12 to 14-year-olds or even newcomers, are just getting introduced to the church and might not know a lot about living a Christian life, they have a better chance of learning God's voice for themselves when they have great examples to follow. That's why it is important to rely on one another and make sure we are learning the shepherd's voice. I mean, Pastor said recently in his message the fact that, followers can't follow other followers. And so it needs to get to a point where we have people in our youth group that are establishing, a relationship with God and knowing that shepherd's voice so they can lead some of our younger members. And even though we don't have the convenience of being with each other, we all know we're under quarantine. There's not that many options. We still have the role to keep each other accountable. Don't be afraid to check in with one another, whether it's a Facebook message, just texting to say, hey, I was thinking about you, or if you need something to pray. We have to keep those strong connections because your flock is relying on you. And just a small caveat, you are not building relationship by just liking each other's posts. Please follow up from there. Yes, it's nice to encourage each other in that sense, but take the time to go ahead and reach out and build stronger connections outside of a post. So in addition to the flock, and in addition to the shepherd's voice, sheep are also protected with sheep pens and fences while they're living in their pastures. So these are boundaries set to ensure that the sheep don't drift too far. So for us, we know that should be our standards and our doctrine. And as long as the boundaries are up for the sheep, they are given that freedom to roam. They are not caged or put on a leash, just free to move in many directions. So when we're presented with a lot of options, sometimes we are so afraid of failing that we paralyze ourselves. It might not be a decision between, am I going to sin or if I'm living a holy life, but it might just be a decision on what ministry to pursue. And so we go back to that horse mentality and ask God to just drag us to whatever ministry he wants for us. And then we choose not to move until we're forced to. But then it gets to a point where you have to realize God gave us free will and he gave us a choice. So you shouldn't be afraid of failing, but encouraged to try new things. So therefore, while you're on this quarantine, I challenge you to start or continue learning your shepherd's voice. Prepare to be useful and an asset to the kingdom on your own or using each other. For example, practice humility or learn another language. If you're interested in missions or even helping out in our deaf ministry, go ahead and learn new languages. There are plenty of YouTube videos. There's Rosetta Stone. There's all these apps where you can practice with people. Take that time to learn the language while you have the free time. Or look up audio and sound how-tos. We use several different softwares at our church. There's probably better programs we could probably use. Why don't you get invested and learn more about those so that you can bring it back to those ministries? Or practice teaching a Bible study, whether that's with your family or with someone else in the youth group, or even just practicing in the mirror, just between you, God, and yourself, just between you and God. That's totally fine. Take that time to practice. Or virtual music lessons. If you have a passion for music, whether it's instruments or singing, take that time to find a YouTube video or reach out to some of our people in the youth group. We have so much talent, so don't be afraid to utilize that. Or cleaning around the house. That is just as much as ministry as any of the things I've listed above. The church's aesthetics are so important, and that's the first impression that people see when they walk through those doors. So, if you need to help your parents around, that's just as much as a ministry as, like I said before. There are a lot of options to get involved, but you shouldn't feel crippled by the decision of which one to try. God has given us the talent and the resources to succeed in our pasture. For sheep, the pasture has everything they need as the shepherd has provided all that is required. Shepherds will go ahead and manage the vegetation, the soil, the temperature, all that is needed for the sheep to have the best place to grow. So when we trust God, we must know the options before us are just opportunities for growth. As long as you're staying within those boundaries, then you shouldn't be afraid to try. If you have enough trust built with God, he will tell you when to try something else or when it's time to move on. And when you're pursuing these ministries, make sure that while you're serving that you never replace your relationship with God. Make sure that you're continually hearing that shepherd's voice. And although you'll be grateful in that opportunity to serve, you have to make sure that you're prepared to go to that next ministry or that next location that God may intend for your life. And you have to make sure that you're listening so that you can be guided to that location. And don't be afraid of the consequences of some of your decisions. You may not be amazing at every ministry you try, but there are going to be lessons and ideas you'll learn from that ministry that will help you later in life. So know that the ministries that you invest in are opportunities for growth. So in closing, if you are within our ancient landmarks and you are familiar with your shepherd's voice, then you won't find yourself lost and constantly going through pain to learn God's will for your life. In Psalms chapter 32, verses 10 through 11, David writes, "Many sorrows shall be to the wicked, but he that trusteth in the Lord, mercy shall compass him about. Be glad in the Lord and rejoice, ye righteous, and shout for joy, all ye that are upright in heart." I want to thank y'all for listening. Hopefully this was encouraging and it was a challenge to some. Thank y'all and be blessed.